The Tragedy of Angron. From Gladiator slave to Daemon Primarch. Among the many tales of heroes fallen and promises broken that fill the dark corridors of imperial history, none carries the weight of inevitable doom quite like the story of Angron, the 12th Primarch. His journey from slave to conqueror, from victim to monster, stands as perhaps the cruelest testament to how even the mightiest can be ground down by the machinery of fate. Where other Primarchs fell through pride or ambition or the seductive whispers of chaos, Angron was pushed. Pushed by slavers who mutilated his mind. Pushed by an emperor who abandoned his family. Pushed by a legion that demanded his leadership while he wished only for death. And pushed, finally, into the eternal service of Khorne, the blood god, where even daemonhood became just another form of slavery. This is not a tale of villainy rewarded or evil triumphant. It is a tragedy written in the blood of billions, a story of a being who might have been humanity's greatest champion, but instead became its most pitiable monster. The Emperor of mankind, in his infinite but not infallible wisdom, created 20 superhuman sons to lead his armies in the reconquest of the galaxy. These were the Primarchs, each engineered to embody specific martial and strategic virtues, each designed to be a general and a leader, a symbol and a weapon. The infant Primarchs were scattered across the galaxy by the machinations of chaos, cast through the warp to distant worlds where they would grow in isolation, their destinies twisted by circumstance and environment. Some landed among nobles and learned statecraft. Others found warrior cultures that honed their combat instincts. But one landed in chains, and that made all the difference. The infant who would become Angron tumbled through the Armageddon until he crashed into the frozen mountains of Nuceria, a world that called itself civilized but whose nobility built their power on blood and suffering. The impact crater was discovered not by rescuers but by fortune seekers. And there they found the infant Primarch surrounded by the corpses of Eldar warriors. Even as a newborn child, Angron had defended himself against Xenos assassins who had glimpsed his future and sought to prevent it. The Eldar, with their gift for farsight, had seen the rivers of blood that would follow in Angron's wake, the mountains of skulls that would be piled in his name. They had come to kill a baby to save billions. They failed, as the Eldar so often did when facing the inexorable machinery of human destiny. But perhaps they succeeded in a way they never intended, for the sight of a baby tearing apart trained warriors should have warned anyone with sense that this was no ordinary child, that this was something precious and dangerous and in desperate need of proper care. Instead, the slavers of Nuceria saw only profit. They saw a child who could survive anything, who could fight when fighting should be impossible, who would never break no matter how much punishment was inflicted. They saw the perfect gladiator. The child was taken in chains to the city of Desh'elika, capital of one of Nuceria's competing city-states. There, in the darkness beneath the arenas where crowds roared for blood and death, a Primarch was given his first lessons in what humanity could become. The High Riders of Nuceria were the aristocratic class who ruled through technology and casual cruelty. They had elevated blood sport to the primary entertainment of their civilization, building massive arenas where slaves fought and died for the amusement of crowds who wagered fortunes on the outcome. It was a society that had achieved significant technological advancement, particularly in cybernetic augmentation and neuromanipulation, but had chosen to deploy those achievements in service of barbarism. Into this world of scheduled murder and profitable death came a child whose strength and resilience marked him as extraordinary even among the enhanced slave warriors of the pits. They named him Angron, after the High Rider house that claimed ownership of him. His slave designation was Thalkir, property of House Thalkir. But among those who fought beside him in the blood-soaked sand, he would come to be known by another name, one earned through desperate battles against impossible odds. The young Angron proved to be everything his captors had hoped for and more. He fought with the ferocity of a cornered predator, his Primarch physiology allowing him to survive wounds that would have killed any normal human 10 times over. He healed from cuts that should have severed arteries. He endured blood loss that should have brought unconsciousness. He kept fighting when exhaustion should have dropped him to the ground. But there was something else, something that his masters found disturbing. The young gladiator showed compassion for his fellow slaves. Between the scheduled bouts of murder, he spoke gently to those who suffered. He used the gift that his creation had given him, an empathic ability that allowed him to ease the pain of others, to share their emotional burdens, to offer comfort in a place designed to crush all hope. This was not the behavior expected from a killing machine. This was not what the High Riders had paid for when they invested in his training and upkeep. And so, they decided to fix him. The procedure was called the Butcher's Nails, though that name came later, a grim joke among the gladiators about the way they had been modified. The technical term, recorded in profane texts sealed in the Hexarcheon vaults on Mars, was the Cruciamen. It was archaeotech from the dark age of technology, one of those achievements that demonstrated both the heights of human ingenuity and the depths of human cruelty. The device consisted of a series of neural implants, cables, and processors that were literally hammered through the skull and deep into the brain tissue, destroying portions of the limbic lobe and insular cortex in the process. Once installed, they could not be removed, not without killing the subject. The implants destroyed the subject's ability to experience any emotion except rage and pain. They created a feedback loop where violence brought momentary relief from constant agony, a biological compulsion that made murder feel like ecstasy and peace feel like torture. The surgeons who performed the procedure were skilled, having installed these devices in hundreds of gladiators before. But they had never worked on a Primarch before, and the biology of a Primarch was something entirely different. When Angron woke from the surgery, he woke screaming. The pain was immediate and constant, a shrieking electrical fire that burned through his consciousness every moment of every day. The empathic abilities that had allowed him to comfort others became a curse, making him feel not only his own agony, but echoes of every nearby mind in distress. Worst of all, the nails had done their job. Killing brought relief. Spilling blood quieted the screaming in his head for precious seconds. Violence was the only medication available for a sickness that would never heal. They had not just taken away his ability to feel joy or peace or hope. They had rewired his brain to crave murder, to need it the way a man dying of thirst needs water. And because he was a Primarch, because his body immediately began trying to heal the damage, and the nails fought back against those healing attempts, the neurodegeneration was progressive and irreversible. Every day, more of his brain tissue was destroyed by the constant war between Primarch regeneration and the archaeotech that prevented it. They had taken a being engineered to be one of humanity's greatest champions and turned him into a living weapon that was destroying itself from within. But they had not broken his spirit, not entirely, not yet. The gladiator who had been called Angron by his masters earned a different name among his fellow slaves. They called him the Lord of the Red Sands, after the blood-stained arena floor where he had won victory after victory. They called him Thalkir, claiming him not as property of a house, but as kin, as family. Because despite the nails, despite the constant pain and the chemical compulsion toward violence, Angron still cared about the people who fought beside him. He still remembered what compassion felt like, even if he could no longer fully feel it himself. He became a champion not because he sought glory, but because winning meant surviving, and surviving meant he could protect those weaker than himself. In the nightmare world of the gladiator pits, where life was measured in scheduled murders and death came as relief, Angron became something unexpected. He became a leader. His fellow gladiators saw in him not just a killing machine, but someone who remembered what it meant to be human, even as that humanity was slowly being stripped away by the devices in his skull. There was a man among the gladiators, a warrior named Onomus, who became Angron's closest friend. Where other fighters saw only the horror of their daily existence, Onomus saw possibility. He spoke of freedom, quietly at first, then with growing conviction as Angron's victories continued to mount. He planted the seeds of rebellion in the minds of slaves who had forgotten that rebellion was even possible. He reminded them that they were not animals, not property, but people who deserved to choose their own fates. And when Onomus died, cut down in the arena by a master's treachery, murdered not in fair combat but through deceit and cowardice, something in Angron finally broke past the pain and the nails and the programming that said he should only kill and never care. The death of his friend became the catalyst for everything that followed. Angron realized in that moment that the choice was simple. He could continue living as a slave, winning in the arenas until age or injury or the progressive degeneration of the nails finally killed him. Or he could die free, fighting against the system that had enslaved him, even if that fight was doomed from the start. He chose freedom. The slave revolt that Angron led began on a night when the moons of Nuceria hung low in the sky, casting red light across the city of Desh'elika. It was not the first uprising in the gladiator pits, but it was the first that succeeded in breaking out of the arenas entirely. Angron and his followers, armed with whatever weapons they could scavenge from fallen guards and stolen armories, fought their way through the defenses and into the streets. They carved a path through the hired soldiers of the High Riders, these enhanced killers proving more than a match for troops who had grown soft bullying the defenseless. The city guard responded with shock and horror, unable to comprehend that their property had turned on them with such organized fury. By the time the sun rose, hundreds of gladiators had escaped the confines of their prison, and the streets of Desh'elika ran red with the blood of those who had profited from their suffering. When the city's defenses finally rallied enough to threaten them with annihilation, the slaves fled into the mountains, taking with them any who would join their cause. Behind them, they left the city in shock, a nobility that suddenly realized their slaves could fight back, and a promise written in blood that this rebellion would not end quietly. In the frozen highlands of Nuceria, far from the blood-soaked sands of the arena, Angron and his army of freed slaves carved out a desperate existence. They numbered perhaps 2,000 at first, gladiators and pit fighters, and anyone else who had chosen death in the mountains over life in chains. They raided supply convoys for food and weapons. They ambushed the military forces sent to recapture them. And with every victory, more slaves fled their masters to join the rebellion, drawn by whispers of a leader who had never lost a battle, who fed his warriors his own blood when they grew too weak to fight, who asked nothing of them except that they stand together against those who would enslave them. The High Riders called them criminals and terrorists, beasts who had forgotten their place. But the slaves called themselves something else. They called themselves the Eaters of Cities, after the fear they inspired in those who had once oppressed them. And they followed Angron not because he commanded them, but because he fought beside them, never asking them to face anything he would not face himself, bleeding with them, starving with them, sharing every hardship of their guerrilla war against a civilization that wanted them dead. For years, the rebellion endured against odds that should have crushed it within weeks. The High Riders sent army after army into the mountains, professional soldiers equipped with the finest weapons that Nucerian technology could provide. Each one was destroyed by gladiators who knew that capture meant a fate worse than death, who fought with the fury of people who had nothing left to lose except each other. They sent hunter teams with tracking equipment and specialized training. They sent specialized military kill squads, elite forces trained specifically to combat enhanced warriors. All of them came back in pieces, or did not come back at all. The victories mounted, each one purchased with blood and desperation, each one proving that even the most oppressed could strike back at their oppressors when they finally decided that freedom was worth dying for. But it could not last. The mathematics of attrition were against them from the start. They had limited food in the barren mountains, surviving on what they could hunt or steal. They had no source of resupply for weapons and equipment, forced to scavenge from the enemies they killed. And every battle, every victory, cost them soldiers they could not replace. The Eaters of Cities were winning every engagement, but losing the war through simple exhaustion, their numbers dwindling while the High Riders could draw on an entire planet's worth of resources. After years of fighting, after countless battles and desperate last stands, Angron's army had been reduced to roughly 1,000 warriors, half the number that had escaped into the mountains with him. They were hungry, exhausted, and running out of places to retreat. The mountains that had once hidden them now felt like a cage, the walls closing in as the enemy forces tightened their net. And finally, after years of tolerating this embarrassment, the High Riders committed to ending the rebellion once and for all. 7 full armies, professional military forces numbering in the tens of thousands, surrounded Angron's position on a mountain called Phaedon Moor, on a spit of desolate land known as Desh'elika Ridge. It was a death trap, and everyone knew it. No amount of skill or courage or desperation could overcome such overwhelming numerical superiority. The gladiators formed their lines and prepared for the last battle they would ever fight. They had no illusions about survival, no false hope that somehow they would overcome against impossible odds. They would die on that ridge, free people standing against tyranny, and perhaps that was victory enough. They had lived as slaves, but they would die free. They had escaped the arenas together, fought and bled together, and now they would die together. It was more than most slaves ever received. Angron moved among his warriors during that final night, speaking words of comfort, even through the shrieking of the nails in his skull. He fed them his own blood when they grew too weak from hunger to stand, using his Primarch physiology to keep his family alive for one more day. They shared stories of the battles they had won, the enemies they had killed, the freedom they had tasted, even if only briefly. Some wept, not from fear, but from the bittersweet knowledge that their suffering was finally ending. Others laughed, dark humor in the face of certain death, joking about which of them would kill the most before falling. They had escaped the arenas together, they had fought and bled together, and they would die together, free and defiant to the end. The night before the final battle, as both sides prepared for the morning assault that would end the rebellion, something impossible happened. A fleet appeared in the sky above Nuceria, ships so massive and advanced that they made Nucerian technology look like children's toys. The stars themselves seemed to dim as these vessels took position in orbit, their presence a statement of power that made even the gathered armies pause in awe and terror. The Emperor of Mankind had been searching for his scattered sons for decades, following psychic emanations and rumors and visions across the galaxy. When he sensed the presence of Angron on Nuceria, he came personally with his custodian guard and the Warhounds Legion, the Space Marines created from Angron's own genetic material. The Emperor had observed his son from orbit for months, watching with what might have been pride as Angron led his slave army against impossible odds. The Master of Mankind saw in his lost son a warrior of unmatched skill, a leader who inspired fanatical loyalty, a champion who would be a valuable asset in the Great Crusade to reunify humanity across the stars.
He saw a Primarch who had never lost a battle, who had led a successful rebellion against overwhelming odds, who commanded through inspiration rather than fear.
What he apparently did not see, or chose not to acknowledge, was the family that Angron had built among those gladiators, the bonds forged through shared suffering that ran deeper than any genetic connection. And then, on the eve of the final battle, with the armies of 7 city-states poised to annihilate Angron's forces at dawn, the Emperor teleported down to Desh'elika Ridge with an offer that would change everything. The meeting between father and son was brief and catastrophic. The Emperor, clad in golden armor that shone even in the darkness, offered Angron command of a legion of space marines. He offered power beyond measure and a lifetime of conquest among the stars. He offered a place at the Emperor's side in the great work of reunifying humanity, the chance to lead armies of superhuman warriors in battles that would shape the future of the entire galaxy. All Angron had to do was accept and leave his current obligations behind. Just walk away from these 1,000 starving gladiators and embrace his true purpose as a Primarch. And Angron, the gladiator, who had spent his entire life being told what to do by masters he despised, did something no other Primarch had ever done. He refused. He looked at the golden figure before him, this being who claimed to be his creator and father, and saw only another master trying to collar him. He told the Emperor that he would stay with his army, that he had led these people into this doomed battle, and he would die alongside them as he had promised. That freedom meant nothing if he abandoned those who had followed him, trusted him, bled with him. The Emperor might offer him command of thousands of warriors, but Angron already had an army. These 1,000 scarred and starving gladiators who had chosen to follow him into certain death, they were his brothers and sisters. They were his family in a way that some distant legion of genetic descendants could never be. He would not leave them to die alone. The Emperor's response to this refusal revealed everything about the fundamental difference between how he and Angron understood leadership and loyalty. The Master of Mankind did not argue. He did not try to convince his son. He did not even acknowledge the gladiators as worthy of consideration in this decision. He simply acted. One moment, Angron was standing on Desh'elika Ridge, surrounded by his army as they prepared for their final stand, his hand clasped in farewell with warriors who had fought beside him for years. The next moment, he was aboard an imperial vessel, teleported away without his consent, without even a chance to say goodbye to the family he had sworn to die beside, ripped from the only moment in his life that had ever mattered. Below, on that barren ridge where 1,000 gladiators waited for their leader to give the signal to attack, there was only confusion, and then understanding, and then despair. 7 armies crashed against 1,000 gladiators, and in the end, as everyone had always known, the armies won. Every single one of Angron's companions was killed. The men and women who had escaped the arenas with him, who had trusted him to lead them to freedom, who had followed him into the mountains and across years of desperate war, died without him. They were butchered to the last warrior on that ridge, their bodies left to rot of a warning to any other slaves who might think to rebel. And Angron, ripped away from the only family he had ever known, was presented with a legion of strangers wearing his genetic code and told that this was a gift, that he should be grateful for this opportunity to serve the Imperium that had just destroyed everything he cared about. The Warhounds, as they were then called, had waited decades to meet their Primarch. They were the 12th Legion, raised on Terra from Angron's genetic template, but without their father to guide them. They had fought in the Great Crusade as a mobile reserve force, earning a reputation for brutal efficiency and absolute commitment to victory at any cost. They prided themselves on their discipline, their tactical flexibility, their ability to break enemy formations through carefully coordinated assaults. They expected to greet their father as the other legions had greeted theirs, with ceremony and celebration and the beginning of a new chapter in their history.
They had prepared speeches and demonstrations of their capabilities. They had studied what little was known about their genesire's exploits on Nuceria, building an image of a tactical genius who had led a successful rebellion against overwhelming odds. What they got instead was a broken, bleeding demigod who killed the first dozen officers who tried to speak to him. The Legion Master Ibram Gir, who had led the Warhounds for 3 decades, approached Angron to welcome him as their Primarch with all the formal respect and ceremony the occasion demanded. Angron tore him apart with his bare hands, barely conscious of what he was doing, seeing only another master trying to claim ownership of him. Officer after officer approached, following the chain of command, each one hoping that they might be the one to reach their Genefather. Through the wall of rage and grief that surrounded him, each one was murdered in turn, their bodies adding to the growing pile of casualties from a reunion that was supposed to be joyous. Angron killed them not with malice, but with the blind fury of someone who had lost everything that mattered, someone whose brain was screaming demands for blood, and whose heart was shattered by the knowledge that his family had died alone because he was not there. The Warhound's command structure was decimated in a matter of hours. 30 years of careful leadership development destroyed in an afternoon, until finally the 8th Company captain, a warrior named Khorne, managed to survive his encounter with his Genefather long enough to actually speak to him. Khorne understood something that the other officers had not, perhaps because he was young enough to see past formal protocols and old enough to recognize genuine suffering when he witnessed it. He saw past the rage and the blood and recognized what Angron truly was beneath the damage. Angron was not some distant figure to be worshipped or a tactical asset to be deployed. He was a warrior who had been denied his death, stolen from his final battle, forced to live when he had earned the right to die free. Khorne spoke to Angron about the gladiators, about their courage and their sacrifice, acknowledging them as warriors worthy of respect rather than dismissed as mere slaves. He spoke about how the Warhounds had their own traditions of ritual combat and brotherhood, how they understood what it meant to stand with your brothers even unto death, how they had been waiting their entire existence for the chance to fight alongside their Genefather. He did not demand anything. He did not try to give orders or appeal to duty or responsibility. He simply spoke, warrior to warrior, acknowledging Angron's loss and offering not replacement but companionship. And slowly, painfully, as the nails temporarily quieted from the exhaustion of so much violence, Angron began to hear him. The conversation lasted hours, Khorne never backing down but never attacking either, standing his ground with a calmness that reminded Angron of Onamaus, his lost friend from the arenas. By the time they finished talking, something had shifted. Angron had not forgiven the Emperor. He would never forgive that betrayal. But he recognized in Khorne and the Warhounds something that might, in time, become a family to replace the one stolen from him. The Primarch was given command of the 12th Legion, though it was unclear whether this was truly a gift or simply the deployment of a weapon, pointing Angron at the Emperor's enemies and letting him kill until he broke. One of his first acts was to rename them. They would no longer be the Warhounds, that name given by an emperor Angron would never forgive, that represented service to a master who had proven unworthy of loyalty. Instead, they would honor the memory of those who had died on Desh'elika Ridge. One of his new captains, a man named Draeger, promised Angron that under his leadership, the Legion would become eaters of worlds, consuming civilizations in their fury, just as the eaters of cities had threatened to consume Nuceria. And so the World Eaters were born, named after the gladiators who had died because their leader was not there to die with them, carrying forward a legacy of rage and loss that would define them for the rest of their existence.
The name was both memorial and curse, a reminder of what had been lost and a promise that the galaxy would pay for that loss in blood. The Emperor, in what might have been mercy or pragmatism or simple indifference, gave Angron unusual autonomy for a newly discovered Primarch. Other sons had been required to shadow their brothers for a period of integration, to spend time learning the ways of the Imperium and the complexities of command before assuming full authority over their legions. Robegay Guilliman had spent months studying imperial governance. Fulgrim had apprenticed himself to Ferrus Manus to learn the arts of war. But Angron was given none of that careful integration. He was simply pointed at his legion and told to reshape them as he saw fit, with minimal oversight or guidance. Some thought this was because the Emperor trusted Angron's strategic instincts, having observed his successful guerrilla campaign on Nuceria. Others believed it was because the Emperor simply wanted this difficult, damaged son deployed and pointed at the enemy as quickly as possible, used as the weapon he had been designed to be, rather than wasting time on integration that might never succeed. Either way, Angron had free rein to reshape his legion, and he reshaped them in the image of the only life he had ever known. He instituted brutal training regiments where failure meant death, not as punishment, but because death was what awaited those who failed in real combat. He organized fighting pits where world eaters fought each other for status and honor, where blood was shed not in war, but in preparation for war, recreating the only social structure he understood. He created a culture that mirrored the gladiator pits, where violence was currency and weakness was fatal, where strength was the only virtue that mattered and compassion was seen as a liability that got people killed. But even these changes, brutal as they were, did not satisfy Angron. He looked at his legion and saw warriors who could never truly understand him, who fought with discipline and precision when he needed them to understand fury and desperation. He saw the way they looked at him, with a mixture of awe and pity and barely disguised horror at what the nails had made him. And in some corner of his mind that the nails had not yet destroyed, in moments of clarity between the pain and the rage, he simply wanted not to be alone in his suffering. If his sons were truly his sons, if they truly wanted to follow him, then they should share what he endured every moment of every day. And so Angron began advocating for something that would corrupt his legion entirely, something that would transform them from disciplined warriors into something else entirely. He demanded that his tech marines and apothecaries reverse engineer the butcher's nails and install them in every world eater. He wanted his sons to feel what he felt, to understand the constant agony that defined his existence, to know the relief that came only through killing. Or perhaps he simply wanted company in his torture, wanted to not be the only one whose brain was being slowly destroyed by archaeotech devices, wanting to drag his legion down into the darkness with him, because if he had to suffer, then they should suffer too. The project was nightmarish from its very inception. The first attempts at replicating the archaeotech devices resulted in a 100% fatality rate. World Eaters volunteered for the procedure, warriors eager to share their Primarch's burden and forge a closer connection with their gene father, and they died screaming on the operating table. Their brains, even enhanced by Astarte's modifications, could not adapt to the foreign neural implants. The nails destroyed too much tissue too quickly, killing them before any benefit could be realized. But Angron persisted. He ordered the experiments to continue despite the casualties, despite the warnings from his apothecaries that this was madness, that the implants were killing his sons faster than any enemy could. The librarians of the Legion, those space marines blessed or cursed with psychic abilities, tried to intervene. They understood that the nails would destroy not just individual warriors, but the Legion's entire capability, that creating an army of berserkers would doom them all. But they were a minority voice, and their concerns were dismissed.
The turning point came during the campaign on the world of Genna, where everything went catastrophically wrong in ways that would shape the Legion's future for the next 10,000 years. Genna was a world that had initially accepted Imperial compliance, welcoming the Imperium's representatives and agreeing to all terms of integration. Then, inexplicably, it cut off all contact, raising enough concern that the World Eaters were dispatched to investigate and restore compliance if necessary. What they found was a civilization that had modified itself extensively with cybernetic enhancements and had created masses of synthetic constructs called simulacra to serve as their population. These artificial beings were simple and crude by the standards of advanced technology, but they existed in the billions, swarming across the planet's surface in dense formations. When the World Eaters made planetfall, expecting either negotiation or a brief punitive strike, they were instead swarmed by these constructs in numbers that threatened to overwhelm even superhuman warriors through simple attrition. The simulacra could not match an Astartes in single combat, but they did not need to. They attacked in waves of thousands, pulling down World Eaters through weight of numbers, sacrificing hundreds to kill a single Space Marine. As always, Angron had given his legion a deadline, demanding they conquer the world within 31 hours, the length of a single Nucerian day, the amount of time that had represented his greatest victory in the arenas. 31 hours to achieve complete compliance, or face the consequences of failure. But Genna's defenses proved more stubborn than expected.
The simulacra kept coming in endless waves, and the World Eaters found themselves bogged down in urban warfare that devoured time and ammunition. When the 31-hour deadline expired with the campaign still ongoing, when Genna remained defiant despite heavy losses, Angron was furious in a way that transcended even his usual rage. He saw his sons failing to meet the standard he had set, failing to honor the memory of his gladiator army that had never failed him. And so he ordered decimation, the execution of 1 in every 10 World Eaters as punishment for their failure to conquer within the allotted time. It was a punishment drawn from ancient Terran military tradition, a method of discipline that sacrificed 10% of a force to inspire fear and obedience in the remainder. Captain Mago, who had led the assault and witnessed the brutal reality of the fighting, refused the order. His defiance should have meant instant death, but instead, Angron found it amusing. Rather than killing Mago himself, he ordered the captain to personally murder the first World Eater to die in the final assault on Genna's primary city. The order was given not in cruelty, but in the twisted logic of someone whose brain no longer processed normal emotional responses, someone who saw combat deaths as inevitable and thought it only fair that the commanding officer claim the first kill personally. It was in keeping with the Nail's demands, with the value system of the gladiator pits, where the strong survived by culling the weak, and leadership was proven through personal violence rather than strategic brilliance. During this campaign, as the World Eaters finally ground down Genna's defenses through sheer bloody persistence, something went catastrophically wrong with Angron's nails. The devices that had been slowly killing him for over a century, that had been destroying his brain piece by piece as his Primarch physiology fought against their presence, suddenly accelerated their degeneration. The constant regeneration and destruction had reached a tipping point. Angron collapsed into a seizure of uncontrolled violence, attacking everything around him without awareness or discrimination. He began cutting down World Eaters who tried to approach him, killing his own sons while barely conscious of what he was doing. The seizure was different from his usual rages. This was not anger directed at an enemy. This was system failure, his brain shutting down under the accumulated damage of decades of progressive neural destruction.
Only the intervention of the Legion's librarians, the Psychers who served as the World Eater's psychic specialists despite being shunned by many of their brothers, managed to subdue him. They used their combined powers to force Angron into unconsciousness, literally knocking him out through psychic assault. Though several died in the attempt, as the Primarch's dying brain lashed out with empathic feedback that burned out their minds. As Angron lay comatose, his body finally given a brief respite from the constant agony of the nails, his apothecary Galon Serlac revealed that he had achieved a breakthrough that would doom the entire Legion.
Using Genin technology recovered during the campaign, studying the way the simulacrous synthetic brains interfaced with their control systems, Serlac had finally perfected a method for installing the butcher's nails in Astarte subjects that would not immediately kill the recipient. The success rate was still horrifyingly low, but it was no longer 0%. World Eaters could now survive the procedure, though survival came with the same price Angron paid: constant pain, progressive neurodegeneration, and the transformation of a disciplined warrior into a berserker who craved violence above all else. Captain Mago, recognizing what this would mean for the Legion, attempted to stop Serlac. He organized other Terran-born veterans who remembered when the Warhounds had been a disciplined, professional force. Warriors who fought with tactical precision rather than blind fury. They understood that installing the nails in the entire Legion would destroy everything that made them effective, would reduce them from a flexible military force to a blunt instrument useful only for frontal assaults. Mago's rebellion failed when he attempted to destroy Serlac's laboratory and was killed by the very warrior who had chosen to undergo the procedure first, the World Eater who would become the bridge between the old Legion and the new. Khorne, the captain who had forged the initial bond with Angron, who had been the only officer to survive his first encounter with the Primarch through understanding rather than force, became the first World Eater to successfully receive the nails and survive. His decision was not made lightly. Khorne understood the risks, had seen the casualties from the failed experiments, knew that the implants would slowly destroy his mind just as they were destroying Angron's. But he also understood that Angron was dying, that his gene father might not survive another year with the progressive degeneration of the nails, and that if the Legion was to maintain any connection with its Primarch, they needed to share his burden. It was an act of loyalty so profound that it bordered on insanity, a willing sacrifice of everything that made him who he was, in the hope that it would forge a deeper connection with a father who was slowly being consumed by madness. When Khorne emerged from the surgery alive, when he stood before his brothers with the nails screaming in his skull and blood running from his eyes, the path was clear for the entire Legion to follow. Not all World Eaters underwent the procedure. Some refused, recognizing it as the corruption it was. Others failed the compatibility tests. But thousands accepted the nails, and in doing so, transformed the World Eaters from a disciplined Legion into the berserkers they would be remembered as for the next 10,000 years. The Emperor knew about the Butcher's nails from the very beginning. He had known from the moment Angron was brought aboard the Warhound's flagship, when his servants examined the new Primarch and reported the neural implants embedded in his skull. The Emperor summoned Archon Land, the famed techno-archaeologist who had explored the Hexarcheon vaults on Mars and cataloged the most dangerous technologies from humanity's past to examine Angron's implants and provide recommendations. Land was one of the few people in the Imperium who had seen similar devices before, sealed away as archaeotech too dangerous to be studied or replicated. He told the Emperor exactly what the Cruciamen was designed to do, how it destroyed the subject's ability to feel anything except rage, how it created a feedback loop that made violence the only relief from constant agony, how it was progressively destroying Angron's brain through the constant battle between Primarch regeneration and the implants that fought against that healing. The prognosis was grim but clear.
The nails were killing Angron, slowly but inevitably, eating away at his neural tissue day by day until eventually there would be nothing left but a raging beast. And when the Emperor asked the question that mattered most, whether the implants could be removed and his son saved, Lan's answer was both yes and no. Yes, the Emperor technically possessed the skill and power to remove the devices. The master of mankind was the greatest psychic and technological genius humanity had ever produced, capable of feats that seemed like magic to those who did not understand the science behind them. If anyone in the galaxy could perform the delicate surgery required to extract the nails, it was the Emperor. But no, doing so would kill Angron, because the nails had already destroyed significant portions of his brain, including his entire limbic lobe and most of his insular cortex. The implants were not just augmentations anymore, not merely parasitic technology attached to healthy tissue. They were prosthetics, artificial replacements for destroyed neural tissue, the only thing keeping those portions of his brain functional at all. Removing them would leave gaps that could not be filled, voids in critical brain structures that even a Primarch could not survive. The Emperor could save his son by killing him, could grant him peace through death, but he could not restore what had been taken. The damage was too extensive, the corruption too thorough. The High Riders of Nuceria had mutilated a Primarch so completely that even the Emperor's power could not undo it. And so, the Emperor made a choice, a decision that would haunt the Imperium for millennia. He chose not to kill his son. He chose to let Angron live with the nails, to deploy him as a weapon despite knowing the Primarch was fundamentally broken and growing worse with each passing day. More significantly, more damningly, the Emperor chose not to prevent the nails from spreading to the World Eater's Legion. He knew what Angron was advocating. He knew that Gahlan Serlak was conducting experiments to replicate the Cruciamen. He knew that thousands of World Eaters would undergo the procedure if it became viable. And he did nothing to stop it. He sent no order forbidding the installations.
He did not recall Angron to Terra for treatment or relief, or anything that might have prevented the tragedy unfolding. He simply let it happen, as if a Primarch and his legion were acceptable losses in the mathematics of galactic conquest. Perhaps the Emperor believed that Angron could be salvaged despite the nails, that the Great Crusade would give him purpose and keep him functional long enough to be useful. Perhaps he calculated that having one legion of berserkers, however unstable, was worth the risk when properly deployed against the right targets. Or perhaps, in that vast and inhuman mind, the Emperor simply decided that some tools were meant to be used until they broke, and then discarded when they were no longer functional. Whatever his reasoning, he took no action to save Angron or protect the World Eaters from the corruption spreading through their ranks. He let the tragedy play out, watching from Terra as one of his sons slowly descended into madness and dragged his entire legion down with him. But someone else did take action, though his intervention would prove worse than useless. Leman Russ, Primarch of the Space Wolves, was dispatched to Gurna with orders to bring the World Eaters back into compliance with the Emperor's will. The official story claimed this was about the massacre of Gurna's population, the way the World Eaters had slaughtered civilians in the frenzy of their final assault, killing not just the simulacra, but organic citizens who had nothing to do with the rebellion. But the real reason, whispered in the halls of Terra and discussed in encrypted communications, was the Butcher's nails. The Emperor wanted them stopped from spreading further through the Legion, wanted the installations halted before the entire World Eater's force was corrupted. And he sent Russ, the so-called executioner, the brother tasked with bringing other Primarchs to heel when they strayed from the Emperor's vision, to deliver the message. It was a task Russ accepted with mixed feelings, understanding the necessity but dreading the confrontation with a brother he had never met, a gene sibling whose reputation was built on uncontrolled violence and barely restrained fury.
The two legions met at Malkoya, on the plains outside the dead Guinan city where the World Eaters had finally achieved their victory. The World Eaters, battered and bleeding from the recent campaign, formed ragged lines before the pristine ranks of the Space Wolves. Thousands of warriors on each side, gene sons of two Primarchs, preparing for a confrontation that might end in bloodshed between brothers. Angron and Russ stood before their respective forces, two brothers who had never met, both armed and armored, both carrying the legendary weapons that had served them through countless campaigns. Angron carried his chain axe Widowmaker, the weapon that had tasted blood in countless arena battles and guerrilla ambushes, its teeth stained with the gore of enemies too numerous to count.
Russ bore Krakenmaw, his frost blade, toothed with remains from some Fenrisian sea beast, a weapon that had killed greenskin war bosses and traitor champions across a dozen worlds. The Wolf King delivered the Emperor's command with the formal authority of someone speaking for the Master of Mankind himself. The implantation surgeries must end immediately. The massacres of civilian populations must stop. The World Eaters would submit to the Space Wolves as escorts for the journey back to Terra, where everything possible would be done to remove the nails from the Legion's minds and restore them to their proper function as disciplined warriors of the Imperium. Angron, standing in blood-soaked armor still carved with fresh wounds from his seizure, refused. He questioned whether the Emperor had actually sent Russ, suggesting that the Wolf King was acting on his own authority, inventing orders to justify his interference. He openly insulted the Emperor, calling him a slave driver no better than the High Riders of Nuceria, a tyrant who demanded absolute obedience while offering nothing but chains dressed up as duty. He joked about taking the imperial throne for himself, about marching the World Eaters to Terra and seeing how the Emperor liked being on the receiving end of a rebellion. And then, without anyone clearly firing the first shot, without any order being given on either side, the two legions collided. Perhaps a nervous finger pulled a trigger. Perhaps the nails drove some World Eater into a charge before he could stop himself. Perhaps Russ made some gesture that was interpreted as hostile. It did not matter. Within seconds, Space Wolves and World Eaters were locked in brutal combat, brothers killing brothers in a pointless engagement that served no purpose except to prove which legion was stronger, which Primarch could impose his will on the other. The Night of the Wolf, as it would be called in the years to come, was a battle that both sides would claim as victory, and both would remember as shame. The Space Wolves fought with the discipline and coordination they were famous for, their tactics precise even in the chaos of Legion versus Legion combat. They moved in coordinated packs, supporting each other, creating overlapping fields of fire, applying the lessons learned through decades of warfare against humanity's enemies. The World Eaters fought like rabid animals, throwing themselves at their enemies with no regard for their own survival, the nails driving them into frenzied assault where the only objective was killing the enemy in front of them. They broke formations to charge individual Space Wolves. They ignored wounds that should have sent them seeking cover. They fought as berserkers, not as soldiers, proving exactly what Russ had come to stop. And at the center of the battlefield, as thousands of Space Marines killed each other around them, two Primarchs dueled. Angron and Russ traded blows that would have killed any normal warrior, their legendary weapons clashing with impacts that rang across the battlefield.
Angron shattered Russ's frostblade, the ancient weapon breaking under the fury of his assault. Russ destroyed Angron's Widowmaker, the chain axe that had served through so many battles, finally meeting something stronger than itself. The weapons that had carried both Primarchs through decades of warfare splintered and broke as demigods clashed with their bare hands when their armaments failed.
Finally, after brutal melee that left both Primarchs bleeding from dozens of wounds, Angron stood victorious. Russ lay on the ground before him, beaten, bloodied, crawling away from his opponent in what looked like retreat or surrender. Angron stood over his brother, savoring his victory, allowing Russ to withdraw while declaring loudly enough for both legions to hear that this proved the Wolf King's failure, that the Emperor's executioner had been defeated by the gladiator everyone dismissed as mad. For a moment, Angron felt something other than pain or rage. He felt vindication, proof that strength was the only thing that mattered, that all the discipline and tactics the Emperor valued were meaningless against raw fury. He had won. The World Eaters had won, and Russ would return to Terra in shame, forced to admit that he could not bring Angron to heel. But then Russ revealed the truth that Angron had been too lost in bloodlust to see, the lesson that the Wolf King had been trying to teach from the beginning. During the duel, while Angron had focused entirely on defeating his opponent in single combat, Russ had been maneuvering. The Space Wolves had not been fighting to win the battle. They had been moving into position, surrounding the dueling Primarchs, establishing a kill box around Angron while he was distracted by combat. Russ's elite Terminator Guard stood in a perfect circle around the Lord of the Red Sands, weapons raised and aimed, fingers on triggers. A single word from Russ, and they would have killed Angron where he stood, cutting him down with concentrated fire before he could reach them. The duel had been a lesson, not a contest of strength. Russ was trying to demonstrate that being the strongest fighter was not the same as being the best general, that a warrior who cared only for killing would always be vulnerable to tactics and strategy, that focusing on the enemy in front of you while ignoring the battlefield around you was a recipe for defeat, that victory required more than individual prowess, that it demanded awareness and planning and coordination. The message was clear, painfully clear to anyone who understood tactics. Angron fought like a beast, and beasts could be caged. Beasts could be surrounded and killed by those who understood how to work together. The nails had destroyed Angron's ability to see beyond the immediate enemy, reducing a Primarch to a mere gladiator who could win individual fights but would always lose the war. But Angron rejected the lesson entirely, refused to acknowledge what Russ was trying to teach him. The duel had been a lesson, not a contest of strength. Russ was trying to demonstrate that being the strongest fighter was not the same as being the best general, that a warrior who cared only for killing would always be vulnerable to tactics and strategy, that focusing on the enemy in front of you while ignoring the battlefield around you was a recipe for defeat, that victory required more than individual prowess, that it demanded awareness and planning and coordination. The message was clear, painfully clear to anyone who understood tactics. Angron fought like a beast, and beasts could be caged. Beasts could be surrounded and killed by those who understood how to work together. The nails had destroyed Angron's ability to see beyond the immediate enemy, reducing a Primarch to a mere gladiator who could win individual fights but would always lose the war. But Angron rejected the lesson entirely, refused to acknowledge what Russ was trying to teach him.
He pointed out that across the broader battlefield, the World Eaters had inflicted more casualties than they had suffered. More Space Wolves lay dead than World Eaters. Therefore, by the simple mathematics of attrition that every gladiator understood, he had won. Victory belonged to the side left standing when the enemy retreated. Everything else was sophistry and excuse, tactical theorizing that meant nothing compared to the brutal reality of who had killed more of the enemy. The body count was what mattered. The rest was just words. The two legions disengaged, both claiming they had proven their point, both privately wondering if they had actually lost something important in the engagement. Russ returned to Terra, having failed to stop the installation of the nails, forced to report to the Emperor that Angron could not be controlled through confrontation or reason. Angron returned to his fleet, having failed to recognize that his brother had tried to teach him something about the difference between a gladiator and a general, about how someone who fights alone will always lose to those who fight together. And the rift between the World Eaters and the rest of the Imperium widened another degree, another step toward the isolation that would make the heresy possible. It would be the word-bearer Primarch Lorgar who later explained to Angron what the Knight of the Wolf had really demonstrated, who tried to make his brother understand the lesson he had missed. The point was not which legion suffered more casualties in raw numbers. The point was that Russ could have killed Angron at any moment during the final exchange, chose not to out of brotherhood and mercy, and Angron never even realized the grace he had been granted. The lesson was about vulnerability, about how rage made you predictable, about how someone who cared only for blood would always be manipulated by those who understood strategy and patience. But Angron would never accept that lesson. He would spend the rest of his existence believing he had defeated Russ that day, that the Wolf King had fled in shame, that victory was measured only in bodies counted and blood spilled. It was the perfect encapsulation of what the Nails had done to him, how they had reduced one of the Emperor's finest sons to a creature who could only understand the world through violence. The Emperor had engineered the Primarchs to be generals who could command armies across entire star systems, who could balance military necessity against political reality, who could win wars through strategy as well as strength. Angron could do none of that anymore. The Nails had burned away his capacity for strategic thinking, leaving only the gladiator who understood combat but not warfare, who could win individual battles but never the campaign. And the tragedy was that he had once been more than that. Before the Nails, during his rebellion on Nuceria, Angron had demonstrated remarkable strategic acumen. He had led a guerrilla war against overwhelming odds, keeping his army alive through careful positioning and tactical flexibility.
He had chosen battlefields that favored his forces and avoided engagements that would have destroyed them. He had been a general, not just a fighter. But the progressive neural degeneration had destroyed that capacity, leaving only the beast that killed and killed and killed until there was nothing left to kill. The World Eaters continued the Great Crusade with their Primarch leading them into ever more savage conquests. Angron instituted the 31-hour time limit for every campaign, one Nucerian day, the length of time it had taken him to win his greatest gladiatorial victory before the rebellion. Any world that could not be conquered in that time frame would result in decimation of the companies that failed, 1 in every 10 World Eaters executed by their brothers as punishment for weakness and failure. The Legion adapted to this brutal standard, developing tactics that prioritize speed and overwhelming violence over careful strategy or concern for collateral damage. They became shock troops par excellence, forces that could be deployed when absolute annihilation was required and civilian casualties were irrelevant. They would drop on a world and attack immediately, no reconnaissance, no careful planning, just pure assault, designed to break the enemy through shock and fury before the defenders could organize a coherent response. The tactic worked more often than it should have. The sheer ferocity of the World Eaters' assault, overwhelming enemies who were expecting negotiation or at least preliminary positioning. But it failed catastrophically when deployed against prepared defenders or tactically sophisticated opponents, leading to unnecessary casualties and failed campaigns that required other legions to clean up the mess the World Eaters left behind. The Legion also became increasingly unstable as more warriors received the Nails. The Berserkers, driven by the implant's demands, would fight anything that moved when the bloodlust grew too strong, sometimes even firing on their allies in the midst of combat when the Nails demanded violence and the only targets available were other Imperial forces. The bonds of brotherhood that had once defined the Warhounds eroded under the constant aggression engineered by the implants. World Eaters began killing each other in the fighting pits, not in ritual combat with rules and respect, but in genuine murder, unable to control the rage that burned in their skulls.
Brothers who had fought together for decades would turn on each other over minor provocations, the nails overriding their conditioning and loyalty. The Legion's chaplains tried to maintain cohesion through appeals to duty and honor, but those concepts meant less and less to warriors whose brains were being rewired to value only violence. And through it all, Angron himself deteriorated visibly and terribly. The nails were killing him, just as Arkan Land had warned, the progressive neural degeneration accelerating with each passing year. Each day brought more loss of cognitive function, more reduction of a Primarch into something barely more than a beast. He began having trouble remembering recent events, asking the same questions repeatedly as his short-term memory failed.
He stopped recognizing warriors he had known for decades, looking at veterans of his legion with blank confusion, as if seeing them for the first time. The lucid moments where he could actually think clearly, where his personality emerged from behind the wall of pain and rage, became increasingly rare and brief. Those who had known him in the early days, warriors like the dreadnought Lork, who had been Legion Master before Angron's discovery, watched in horror as their father spiraled deeper into madness. Lork, in particular, had served as Warhound's Legion Master, commanding the 12th Legion before their Primarch was found. He remembered what the Legion had been, remembered the discipline and tactical flexibility that had made them effective. And he watched as all of that was systematically destroyed by a Primarch who was himself being destroyed by the devices in his skull. Lork was eventually interred in a dreadnought after suffering catastrophic wounds. His broken body placed in a walking sarcophagus that allowed him to continue fighting despite injuries that would have killed any normal space marine. From within his armored shell, he witnessed the Legion's transformation with a perspective that spanned the entire journey from Warhounds to World Eaters. He spoke sometimes of the warrior Angron had been when first discovered, before the nails had destroyed so much of his capacity for thought. And he mourned what had been lost, even as he served the monster his Primarch had become. When Horus Lupercal, the War Master, turned against the Emperor and began the galaxy-spanning civil war that would be called the Horus Heresy, Angron was among the first Primarchs to join him. Not because he believed in Horus's vision of the future or agreed with his philosophical reasons for rebellion. Angron cared nothing for the political tensions between the Primarchs, nothing for the theological arguments about the emperors, nothing for the War Master's ambitions or grievances. He joined the heresy because Horus told him exactly what he wanted to hear, that the emperor had betrayed them all, that the so-called master of mankind deserved to burn for his crimes against his own sons, that rebellion was justice rather than treason. For Angron, the heresy was not about ideology or ambition or building a new imperium. It was pure revenge, finally given permission and purpose, a chance to strike back at the being who had stolen him from Desh'elika Ridge, who had denied him the death he had earned alongside his family, who had taken everything that mattered and replaced it with a legion of strangers and a lifetime of service to an imperium he despised. When the call came to rebel, when Horus asked if Angron would stand with him against the Emperor, Angron answered not as a traitor, but as a freed slave, finally given permission to attack his former master. The World Eaters threw themselves into the heresy with the same savage enthusiasm they brought to every conflict, finally unleashed without any pretense of restraint or noble purpose. They were participating in the destruction of everything the Emperor had built, and for warriors whose brains had been rewired to crave violence, that was purpose enough. The opening moves of the heresies saw the traitor legions purging their own ranks of those who would remain loyal to the Emperor. On Istavan III, a world that had recently rebelled against imperial rule, 4 legions descended to bring it back into compliance. The sons of Horus, World Eaters, Death Guard, and Emperor's children deployed to the surface, ostensibly to restore imperial authority. But the forces sent to the planet were carefully selected. They were the warriors within each legion who would never accept rebellion against the Emperor, the loyalists who would fight for Terra even if their Primarchs turned traitor, The veterans who remembered the Great Crusade's original purpose, the idealists who still believed in the Emperor's vision, they were sent to Isstvan III not to conquer, but to die. As the Loyalists fought against the planet's defenders, believing they were conducting a normal compliance action, the traitor fleets opened fire from orbit. Virus bombs fell on Isstvan III, weapons so horrific they had been forbidden for use against human populations. The viral payload swept across the planet, killing everything organic, liquefying flesh and bone, transforming a living world into a mass grave in a matter of hours. Millions died, including thousands of space marines who had been loyal to the Emperor to the end. But some survived the initial bombardment, protected by sealed bunkers or lucky enough to be underground when the virus struck. These loyalist space marines, betrayed by their own primarchs, organized themselves into a defensive force under the leadership of Garvia Loken of the Sons of Horus and Nathaniel Garrow of the Death Guard. They held out for weeks, fighting not for victory, but to survive long enough to warn the Imperium of the betrayal. And eventually one ship escaped, the Eisenstein, carrying Garrow and the few survivors who managed to reach it, fleeing toward Terra with the desperate news that the War Master had turned traitor. The World Eaters participated enthusiastically in the purge of Isstvan III, both in the orbital bombardment and in the subsequent ground assault to eliminate survivors. For Angron, there was no moral conflict in killing his own sons. The Nails had long since destroyed his capacity for such concerns. There were only enemies to be killed, and it did not matter whether they wore loyalist or traitor colors. His World Eaters descended to the virus-scorched surface and hunted their former brothers through the ruins, turning the planet into a charnel house where space marines killed space marines while the galaxy watched in horror. But even among traitors, even among legions that had turned from the Emperor's light and embraced the darkness of rebellion, the World Eaters stood apart in their brutality. The other traitor legions fought for comprehensible reasons, whether corrupted or rational.
The Sons of Horus fought for their Primarch's ambition, believing that Horus would be a better ruler than the Emperor. The Thousand Sons fought to preserve their existence after persecution by those who feared Psykers. The Death Guard fought because Mortarion led them into Nurgle's embrace, seeking relief from the same kind of suffering Angron endured. But the World Eaters fought simply to fight, to kill, to satisfy the endless demands of the Nails that screamed in their skulls. They became a problem even for their allies, forces that could not be controlled or directed once combat began. At Armatura, when the Word-Bearers and World Eaters assaulted a major Ultramarine stronghold together, the battle devolved into a bloodbath that horrified even the Chaos-worshipping Word-Bearers. The World Eaters could not be controlled once combat began. They attacked anything that moved, friendly forces included, driven by the Nails into frenzies where the only thing that mattered was blood and death and the temporary relief that violence brought. Imperial army troops fighting alongside them were just as likely to be killed by World Eaters as by the enemy. Allied Space Marines learned to maintain distance from the 12th Legion during combat, knowing that getting too close meant risking becoming a target when the Nails took over. Lorgar Aurelian, Primarch of the Word-Bearers, watched in dismay as Angron's legion tore through carefully laid battle plans, ruining strategic objectives in favor of simple slaughter. The Word-Bearers valued ritual and purpose, conducting warfare as an act of worship to the dark gods they served. But the World Eaters just killed, finding no meaning in the deaths they inflicted beyond the momentary silence of the Nails. It was during the Shadow Crusade, as the two legions fought together through the 500 worlds of Ultramar, that Lorgar realized something had to be done. Not to stop Angron, but to save him. The Primarch of the World Eaters was dying, visibly and rapidly, the Nails consuming the last fragments of his brain. He had seizures daily now, episodes where he lost all control and attacked whoever was closest. His speech had become fragmented, words coming with difficulty as the language centers of his brain were progressively destroyed. He could no longer remember the names of most of his captains, looking at warriors who had served him for decades with blank incomprehension. The apothecaries estimated he had perhaps a year left, maybe 2 if he was fortunate, before the neural degeneration progressed to the point where even his Primarch physiology could not sustain life. And Lorgar, who had always been the most spiritual of the Primarchs, the one who sought meaning beyond simple conquest, saw in Angron's impending death both tragedy and opportunity. Lorgar had always been different from his brothers, seeking deeper truths while they focused on military victories. Where the Emperor demanded atheism and reason, Lorgar had worshipped his father as divine, building monuments and cathedrals, spreading the imperial truth as religious doctrine rather than secular philosophy. Lorgar had always been different from his brothers, seeking deeper truths while they focused on military victories. Where the Emperor demanded atheism and reason, Lorgar had worshipped his father as divine, building monuments and cathedrals, spreading the imperial truth as religious doctrine rather than secular philosophy.
When the Emperor rejected that worship, humiliating Lorgar and the word-bearers on the world of Monarchia by ordering the destruction of their perfect city and forcing them to kneel in its ashes, Lorgar had turned to other gods. He sought out the powers in the warp, the entities that humans had worshipped throughout history under thousands of different names. And he found the Chaos Gods, 4 vast intelligences that ruled the Immaterium, beings who were eager to accept devotion from a Primarch. Now Lorgar served these ruinous powers, spreading their worship across the galaxy, conducting rituals and sacrifices in their name. And in watching Angron slowly die from the Nail's progressive destruction, Lorgar saw an opportunity not just to save his brother, but to elevate him, to transform him into something that could never die, never truly be defeated. A Daemon Primarch, a fusion of mortal flesh and warp entity, a champion of the blood god Khorne who embodied war and violence and martial prowess. Lorgar believed he was offering salvation. He believed he was giving his brother the gift of immortality and freedom from the constant pain of the Nails. He could not have been more wrong about what Angron actually wanted, but by the time that became clear, it was far too late to stop what had been set in motion. Lorgar proposed an alliance that he called the Shadow Crusade, a joint campaign that would see the Word-Bearers and World-Eaters fighting together through the 500 worlds of Ultramar. The official purpose was strategic, to tie down the Ultramarines and prevent Robote Guilliman from reinforcing Terra before Horus could break the Imperial Palace. Ultramar was the 13th Legion's empire, a cluster of 500 worlds organized under Guilliman's careful governance into the most prosperous and well-defended region in the Imperium. If the Word-Bearers and World-Eaters could rampage through those worlds, destroying infrastructure and killing the Ultramarines piecemeal, it would cripple one of the Emperor's most powerful legions and eliminate a major threat to the heresy's success. But Lorgar's true agenda was spiritual rather than military. He would use the campaign to gather power, to perform rituals, to slowly prepare Angron for the transformation that awaited him. Every battle would be a sacrifice to Khorne. Every world burned would weaken the barrier between reality and the warp. And the Primarch of the World-Eaters, caring nothing for Lorgar's hidden purposes, agreed to the alliance simply because it meant more killing, more battles, more opportunities to satisfy the Nail's endless demands. The Shadow Crusade became one of the bloodiest campaigns of the entire heresy, a path of destruction carved through Ultramar that left dozens of worlds burning and millions dead. The World-Eaters and World-Bearers operated differently enough that conflicts between the legions were constant and inevitable. The Word-Bearers wanted to conduct elaborate rituals, to sacrifice populations in specific ways that honored the Chaos Gods they served. They saw warfare as worship, each kill an offering to dark powers, each world burned, a cathedral built from ashes. But the World Eaters just wanted to kill everything as quickly as possible, caring nothing for ceremony or worship or the spiritual significance of their violence. They would attack before the word-bearers completed their preparations, ruining carefully planned sacrifices. They would slaughter entire populations without bothering to sort combatants from civilians, turning potential ritual sacrifices into simple massacre. Lorgar tried to teach Angron about the Chaos Gods, explaining the nature of Khorne, the blood god who represented war and violence and martial honor. He described Khorne as the embodiment of every battle ever fought, every drop of blood ever spilled, existing in the warp as a vast intelligence that fed on mortal conflict. He explained how worship of Khorne could grant power, how serving the blood god brought rewards for those who spilled enough blood in his name. But Angron rejected the notion that gods even existed, dismissing the Chaos Gods as parasites rather than deities worthy of worship. He called them warp entities feeding on mortal emotion, no more worthy of reverence than the slavers of Nuceria had been. They were predators, not gods, using humans as livestock for their hunger. Angron understood instinctively what many who worshipped chaos refused to acknowledge, that the Chaos Gods were not allies or patrons, but parasites that consumed their worshippers. He had spent his entire life being used by others, enslaved by the High Riders, mutilated by their surgeons, denied his death by the Emperor, commanded by an imperium he never chose to serve. The idea of bowing to yet another master, even one that promised power in exchange for service, was anathema to everything he believed. If the gods wanted his service, they could try to take it, but he would never give it willingly. This fundamental rejection of chaos worship distinguished Angron from the other traitor Primarchs. Magnus sought power to save his legion. Mortarion sought relief from suffering. Fulgrim sought pleasure and sensation beyond mortal limits. But Angron sought nothing from the Chaos Gods except to be left alone, to fight and kill until the nails finally destroyed him completely. Lorgar watched this resistance with growing concern, realizing that his brother would never willingly accept the transformation being prepared for him, that the ritual would have to be forced rather than embraced. Throughout the Shadow Crusade, as the two legions burned their way through Ultramar, Angron's condition deteriorated visibly and terribly. The Nails were winning their long war against his Primarch physiology, accelerating their destruction as if sensing that time was running out. Seizures became more frequent, episodes where he lost all control and attacked anyone nearby without discrimination. He killed World Eaters who approached him during these episodes, tearing apart his own sons while barely conscious of what he was doing. His memory grew fragmented and unreliable, unable to recall recent events or recognize warriors he had known for decades. Veterans would stand before their Primarch and receive blank stares, as if Angron was seeing them for the first time, despite having fought beside them for years. The lucid moments where he could actually think clearly, where his personality emerged from behind the wall of pain and rage that defined his existence, became increasingly rare and brief. Those moments, when they came, were perhaps worse than the rages. In those brief windows of clarity, Angron understood what he had become, what the Nails had reduced him to, and the knowledge was agony beyond even the physical pain of the implants. He would speak then of Desh'elika Ridge, of the family he had lost, of the death he had been denied. He would apologize to his sons for being unable to be the father they deserved, for dragging them into the darkness with him. And then the Nails would reassert control, driving him back into rage and pain, and the lucid Angron would disappear again. Lorgar watched this degeneration with growing alarm, knowing that time was running out faster than anticipated. Without intervention, Angron would simply die, probably in some meaningless skirmish. His remarkable existence ended not by a worthy opponent, but by the simple failure of the devices that had enslaved him since childhood. The galaxy would lose one of its most powerful warriors.
The heresy would lose a potent weapon against the Emperor, and the World Eaters would lose the only thing holding them together as anything resembling a legion. And so, Lorgar made preparations for the ritual that would save his brother, whether Angron wanted to be saved or not. The location chosen for this final act was symbolically perfect, a return to the place where everything had gone wrong. They would return to Nuceria, the world where Angron had been enslaved, where he had fought in the arenas, where his rebellion had begun and ended in betrayal. They would return specifically to Desh'elika Ridge, where the Eaters of Cities had made their final stand, where 1,000 gladiators had died alone because the Emperor stole Angron away. And there, in that place soaked with the blood of his family, in sight of the bones of the warriors he had failed, Angron would be reborn as something that could never die, never be abandoned, never fail his family again, because he would no longer be capable of the emotions required for failure or shame or grief. When the World Eaters and Wordbearers arrived at Nuceria, they found the Ultramarines waiting for them. Robot Guilliamon, Primarch of the 13th Legion, had tracked the traitors through Ultramar, following the path of destruction they left behind. He had fortified the Nuceria system in anticipation of this assault, establishing defensive positions, deploying his forces according to the careful strategic doctrine that made the Ultramarines the most reliable legion in the Imperium. His forces occupied the high ground, established kill zones, prepared defensive positions with overlapping fields of fire, and pre-sighted artillery coordinates.
It should have been a slaughter. The well-prepared Ultramarines destroying the charging World Eaters through superior tactics and positioning. Guilliman had every advantage. He had chosen the ground. He had superior intelligence about the terrain. He had organized his forces for maximum efficiency. But Guilliman had made one critical miscalculation that rendered all his careful planning irrelevant. He had assumed this was a military operation, a battle to be won through conventional means, legions clashing in tactical engagement with victory going to whoever planned better and executed more effectively. He had not realized this was a pilgrimage, that Angron was returning home to die or be transformed, that no amount of defensive preparation could stop warriors who cared nothing for their own survival, who welcomed death as relief from the nails' constant agony. The World Eaters crashed into Ultramarine positions with a fury that defied all tactical sense and military logic. They died by the thousands, cut down by disciplined bolter fire from defensive positions, annihilated by carefully prepared kill zones and pre-sighted artillery. But they kept coming, driven by the nails and by something else, the knowledge that their Primarch was dying, and this might be their last battle beside him. For every World Eater who fell, 10 more charged over his body, stepping on their dead brothers to reach the enemy. The nails demanded blood, and the only blood available was Ultramarine. Guilliman watched from his command position as his perfect defensive lines crumbled under assault, as carefully prepared positions were overrun by warriors who should have broken and instead pressed forward through impossible casualties. His tactical displays showed massive World Eater losses, numbers that should have represented complete collapse of unit cohesion. But the 12th Legion kept attacking as if the casualties meant nothing. And at the front of this suicidal assault came Angron himself. No longer capable of strategic thinking, barely capable of distinguishing friend from enemy. Just a dying demigod thrashing against the universe in his final hours. He tore through Ultramarines in their perfectly prepared positions, his mere presence inspiring his World Eaters to greater heights of violence. Guilliman, witnessing this carnage, realizing that his brother's deteriorating condition made him more dangerous rather than less, made the decision to confront Angron directly.
The Lord of Ultramar descended from his command position and challenged Angron to single combat, Primarch against Primarch, warrior against warrior, hoping that removing the catalyst would stop the slaughter and allow his Ultramarines to restore some kind of order to the battlefield. It was a decision born of desperation and honor both, an attempt to stop the bloodshed by accepting personal risk, to meet his brother as an equal, even though that brother had fallen to madness and betrayal. The duel between Guilliman and Angron was profoundly unequal from the start, demonstrating the brutal reality that not all Primarchs were created for the same purpose. Guilliman was a brilliant strategist, a master of combined arms warfare and logistical planning, a Primarch who had built an empire through careful governance and wise policy. He was a swordsman of considerable skill, trained in dozens of martial disciplines, capable of defeating almost any opponent through technique and precision. But in single combat, against a dedicated killer whose brain had been engineered to crave violence, whose every instinct had been honed in the gladiator pits where losing meant death, who felt no fear and acknowledged no pain, Guilliman was outmatched from the first exchange of blows. Angron beat him savagely, breaking bones and tearing flesh with an efficiency that demonstrated the difference between a general who knew how to fight and a gladiator who knew nothing else. Guilliman tried to apply technique, to use his training and skill to compensate for the disadvantage in raw aggression. But technique required thought, planning, the ability to predict and counter. Angron simply attacked, driven by the nails and by fading consciousness, every blow meant to kill, every movement optimized for violence. Guilliman's armor was torn open, his primary heart was pierced, his skull was fractured, one arm was nearly severed at the shoulder. He fell beneath Angron's assault, his body broken almost beyond even Primarch healing, blood pooling beneath him as he struggled to maintain consciousness. For a moment, it seemed the Lord of Ultramar would die there, killed by a brother who had become something monstrous, another tragedy added to the countless tragedies of the heresy. But as Angron raised his weapon for the killing blow, as Guilliman prepared to die, Lorgar acted. The word-bearers had been preparing the ritual throughout the battle, using the blood shed by both sides to fuel their sorcery, conducting ceremonies at carefully chosen locations across Nuceria. Across the planet, in sites of spiritual significance determined through dark calculation, word-bearers' chaplains sacrificed captured Ultramarines in specific ritual configurations designed to weaken the barrier between reality and the warp. They chanted invocations to Khorne, the blood god, offering not just lives but meaning, the death of heroes fighting for something they believed in, the destruction of hope represented by the Ultramarines' disciplined resistance. Each sacrifice was precisely calculated to generate the maximum spiritual resonance, to call across the warp to powers that thrived on violence and death. And on Desh'elika Ridge, where 1,000 gladiators had died without their leader, Lorgar performed the final component of the ritual. He called to the warp, to the power that thrived on war and violence and death, the entity humans had worshipped throughout history as gods of battle. He offered that power a champion, a warrior who had spent his entire existence in service to violence, whose life had been nothing but blood and pain from his first conscious moment. He offered Khorne the soul of Angron, and Khorne accepted eagerly, seeing in the Lord of the Red Sands the perfect vessel for his will, a being already so steeped in violence that the transformation would be seamless. Using his own psychic powers and the energy gathered through mass sacrifice, Lorgar teleported Guilliman away to safety, denying Angron the kill, but preserving Guilliman's life for future battles. Some accounts suggest this was mercy, that Lorgar could not stomach killing another brother in cold blood, despite all the horrors he had already committed. Others claim it was strategic calculation, that letting Guilliman escape would prolong the war and create more opportunity for blood sacrifice. Either way, the Primarch of the Ultramarines survived his encounter with the Daemon Primarch, though he would carry the scars of that defeat for the rest of his life, both physical and psychological reminders of the day he faced a brother and lost. The transformation of Angron from Primarch to Daemon Prince was agony beyond anything even the butcher's nails had inflicted, pain that transcended the merely physical into spiritual torment. His body tore itself apart as warp energy flooded into him, rewriting reality at the most fundamental level, changing not just his flesh but his very essence. Flesh became something more than flesh, material infused with immaterial power, a fusion of physical form and warp entity that existed partially in both realms simultaneously. Bone became something harder than any natural substance, reinforced with the metaphysical weight of Khorne's dominion. Blood became liquid fire that burned with the rage of the warp itself. No longer mere hemoglobin, but fury given physical form. He grew, his already massive Primarch frame expanding to monstrous proportions that dwarfed even his gene sons. Wings erupted from his back, vast pinions of brass and black leather that could carry him through both sky and warp, allowing flight through both material and immaterial space. His face elongated, his features becoming bestial and demonic. The handsome visage of a Primarch replaced by something that inspired terror in all who witnessed it. Tusks and horns sprouted from a skull that could no longer be called human. Weapons as much as features, capable of goring enemies who got too close. The butcher's nails, the devices that had enslaved him since childhood, the archaeotech that had defined his existence and slowly destroyed his mind, melted into his transformed brain. They became part of him at a level deeper than neural tissue, fused into his essence as a daemon, no longer foreign implants but integral components of what he had become. And in that moment of transformation, Angron achieved what he had always desired, what he had sought since the day the High Riders mutilated him. The pain stopped. The constant screaming agony that had tormented him for over a century, the electrical fire that burned through his consciousness every moment of every day, simply ended. The nails were gone, not removed but incorporated, their function made obsolete by the transformation into something that existed beyond the limitations of mortal neurology. He was free of the nails at last, free of the pain that had defined his existence, free of the progressive neural degeneration that had been slowly killing him.
But the price of that freedom, the cost of that relief, was everything that had made him who he was. The gladiator Angron died in that transformation, burned away by warp energy and replaced by something else entirely. And what emerged from the ritual was a creature that wore his name and carried his memories, but lacked everything essential that had once defined the Lord of the Red Sands. The Daemon Primarch Angron was not the same being as the gladiator who had led the Eaters of Cities in rebellion. The transformation had burned away something essential, some core of identity that separated person from beast, that made the difference between a warrior and a weapon. He still possessed his memories, could still recall the arenas and the rebellion and Desh'elika Ridge with perfect clarity. But those memories no longer carried emotional weight, no longer meant anything beyond simple data. The empathy that had once been his defining characteristic, the ability to ease the suffering of others even through his own pain, was gone entirely, consumed in the transformation into Daemon. The compassion that had made him lead a slave revolt rather than seek personal escape, that had driven him to protect those weaker than himself even when the nails demanded he kill them, had been burned away.
What remained was a creature of pure violence, a weapon that existed only to kill, that found meaning only in bloodshed, that served Khorne's will without question or resistance. Khorne had not saved Angron. Khorne had completed what the High Riders began, taking a damaged warrior and finishing the process of reducing him to nothing but rage and violence. Where the mortal Angron had been a slave to the nails, but still retained fragments of his humanity, still experienced moments of lucidity where his personality emerged, the Daemon Primarch was a slave to Khorne in a way that was absolute and eternal. Bound by demonic nature to serve the blood god's desires, unable to resist the compulsions built into his very essence, Angron had traded one form of slavery for another. Mortal chains for immortal ones, temporal masters for eternal ones. The High Riders had enslaved his body through physical restraints. The nails had enslaved his mind through neuromanipulation, and Khorne enslaved his soul through the transformation into Daemon, binding him to service that would last for eternity, that could never be escaped or negotiated or ended. He had fought his entire mortal life for freedom, leading a rebellion against tyranny, choosing death over slavery. And in the end, he became the ultimate slave, property of a god who demanded everything and gave nothing except the power to kill forever. The newly ascended Daemon Primarch turned his attention back to the battlefield where Guilliman had been moments before, seeking the kill he had been denied. But Lorgar had teleported the Ultramarine away to safety, preserving his life for future conflicts.
For a moment, witnesses reported, Angron seemed confused, as if some part of him recognized that something had been taken, that he should be different than he was. But the confusion passed quickly, burned away by the demands of his demonic nature. And the creature that had been Angron, standing on the ridge where his family had died without him, newly transformed into an immortal engine of slaughter, felt nothing. No satisfaction at his ascension, no grief for what he had lost, no connection to the place that should have held profound meaning. He was free of the nail's pain, but he had paid for that freedom with everything that made pain worth enduring. The World Eater's Legion looked upon their transformed Primarch with reactions ranging from worship to horror, unable to comprehend what they were witnessing. Some saw his ascension as the ultimate victory, their father elevated to godhood, proof that their path of blood had been correct all along, that the violence they embraced led somewhere transcendent. They fell to their knees and offered prayers to Khorne, suddenly understanding the spiritual dimension of their warfare that had previously escaped them. Others recognized it as the final tragedy, the last piece of the person they had known burned away in service to powers they barely understood, the transformation of their father from damaged warrior into something that was no longer really their father at all. Khorne, who had been the first to receive the nails voluntarily, who had forged the initial connection with Angron decades earlier through understanding and patience, wept when he saw what his gene father had become. Even through the rage of his own nails, even with his mind twisted by chaos, corruption, and years of constant warfare, Khorne understood that they had not saved Angron. They had simply found a new way to enslave him, a more thorough and permanent enslavement than even the High Riders had managed. The gladiator who had fought for freedom, who had led a rebellion against tyranny despite knowing it was doomed, who had refused to abandon his family even when offered power beyond measure, now served the most tyrannical master imaginable. The Chaos Gods did not negotiate or compromise, did not allow their champions to retire or rest or choose a different path. They consumed their servants utterly, using them until there was nothing left and then discarding them for the next willing sacrifice. Angron had become Khorne's property, as surely as he had once been property of House Dalkra, and this slavery would last for eternity rather than merely a mortal lifetime. The Eaters of Cities had died free on Desh'elika Ridge, choosing death over slavery, believing their sacrifice meant something. But Angron never died, never achieved the freedom that death would have brought.
He was denied that mercy, denied that final escape, transformed instead into something that would serve forever, killing and killing and killing in Khorne's name without end or purpose beyond the blood god's eternal hunger for violence.
That was the tragedy that Khorne wept for, that some world eaters understood even through their own corruption. They had not elevated their father, they had damned him to a slavery worse than anything he had endured in mortal life. The Daemon Primarch Angron participated in the final phases of the Horus Heresy as a living weapon of catastrophic power, a force of nature that cared nothing for strategy or objectives beyond simple slaughter. He manifested on Terra during the siege of the Imperial Palace, leading his world eaters in assaults that targeted no specific military goals but simply killed everything they encountered. He did not care about capturing strategic positions or eliminating key commanders. He existed only to kill, to satisfy the eternal demands of Khorne, to spill blood for the blood god without consideration for whether that blood belonged to loyalist or traitor, soldier or civilian, guilty or innocent. His demonic form granted him resilience that made him nearly impossible to destroy through conventional means. Bolter fire that would have killed a normal space marine bounced off his transformed hide. Plasma weapons that could burn through tank armor left scorch marks but failed to slow him. He was no longer bound by the limitations of mortal flesh, existing partially in the warp where physical damage meant less than spiritual strength. He killed custodians, the Emperor's personal guard, who were physiologically superior even to space marines, tearing them apart with casual gestures despite their legendary skill and equipment. He killed space marines from loyalist legions, wading through disciplined formations and leaving nothing but corpses in his wake. He killed Imperial Army soldiers by the thousands, mere humans standing no chance against a creature that had transcended mortality entirely. And when he dueled Sanguinius of the Blood Angels in the skies above Terra, when two winged Primarchs clashed in combat witnessed by millions across the planet, their battle became the stuff of legend and nightmare. Sanguinius represented everything Angron had lost and could never reclaim: nobility, grace, a purpose beyond violence. Where Angron was a crimson monster of brass and rage, Sanguinius was a golden angel, beautiful and terrible, wielding his spear with precision born from skill rather than mere fury. The duel lasted for hours, Primarchs clashing across the burning sky of Terra, and in the end, Sanguinius drove Angron back. The Blood Angel's spear found its mark, piercing the Daemon Primarch's essence in a way that disrupted his physical manifestation. Angron's form destabilized, his presence in reality becoming unsustainable as the wound spread through both his physical and spiritual components. With a scream of rage that shattered windows across the surrounding districts, the Daemon Primarch was banished, his physical body destroyed and his essence sent screaming back into the warp. It was a victory for Sanguinius, proof that even transformed Primarchs could be defeated by those who retained their humanity. But it cost the Blood Angel dearly, the combat draining his strength and leaving him wounded in ways that would not heal before his final confrontation with Horus.
And for Angron, the banishment was merely temporary inconvenience rather than true defeat. Daemons cannot be permanently destroyed, only banished to the warp, where they reform and wait for the next opportunity to manifest. He would return, as daemons always return, as inevitable and patient as death itself. And when the heresy ended in the traitor's defeat, when Horus died and the surviving traitor legions fled into the Eye of Terror, Angron went with them. Not because he cared about survival or had any investment in future plans for revenge against the Imperium, but because a Daemon Primarch existed primarily in the warp, the material universe merely a place to visit briefly during manifestations. The Eye of Terror, a massive warp rift where reality and immaterium blended together, was more home to him now than any physical location could ever be. For 10,000 years following the heresy, the World Eaters scattered into individual warbands and berserker packs, the last fragments of their legion structure dissolving entirely. Without Angron's constant presence, without any organizing principle beyond the Nail's demand for violence, the 12th Legion fragmented into countless smaller forces spread across the galaxy. They became raiders and pirates, attacking Imperial worlds not for strategic value, but simply because attacking was all they knew how to do. They worshipped Khorne with varying degrees of devotion, some maintaining elaborate rituals and shrines, while others simply killed in the blood god's name without ceremony or theology. They were the most feared Chaos Space Marines in the galaxy, not because they were the most skilled or the most numerous, but because they were utterly predictable in their unpredictability. A warband of World Eaters would attack with absolute commitment, fighting until they were destroyed or victorious, never retreating or surrendering or accepting anything except total slaughter. Imperial commanders learned to recognize the signs of World Eater presence and prepare accordingly, knowing that negotiation was impossible and the only options were complete victory or total defeat. The individual World Eaters themselves continued to deteriorate under the Nail's influence, most losing any semblance of personality or individual identity within decades of the heresy's end. They became walking weapons, barely more than beasts wearing power armor, kept functional only through the dark blessings of Khorne. New recruits to the scattered warbands, aspirants seeking to join the World Eaters' ranks, underwent the Nails as part of their initiation, perpetuating the cycle of corruption across generations. The Legion that had once prided itself on tactical flexibility and disciplined assault had been reduced to berserkers who existed only to kill, who found meaning only in violence, who served Khorne because they were no longer capable of serving anything else. And occasionally, when the veil between materium and immaterium grew thin enough, when sufficient blood had been spilled to weaken reality's barriers, when conditions aligned in the proper spiritual configuration, Angron himself would manifest to lead them once more.
The most famous of these manifestations occurred in the year 444 of the 41st millennium, 99 years and 99 days after the Horus Heresy ended, on the imperial world of Armageddon. The world was a vital manufacturing center, a hive world whose countless forges produced weapons and armor for the Imperial Guard, protected by significant military forces and orbital defense platforms that should have deterred all but the most determined attackers. It should have been capable of withstanding most threats, short of a full Legion assault. But when the Daemon Primarch Angron tore his way through the veil of reality, when he manifested in the skies above Armageddon Secundus with an army of World Eaters and Khornate daemons numbering in the tens of thousands, the world's defenders realized they faced something beyond their capacity to defeat through conventional military means. The numbers alone were overwhelming, but the presence of a Daemon Primarch elevated the threat to existential. This was not just an enemy army. This was a fragment of a chaos god's will made manifest, supported by entities that existed partially outside reality. The first war for Armageddon became a nightmare conflict that would scar the world for centuries to come, a battle that demonstrated exactly why Daemon Primarchs were considered among the greatest threats the Imperium could face. Angron led his forces in a rampage through the primary hive city of Infernus, killing millions of civilians who had no chance of defending themselves against demonic assault. The Imperial Guard regiments deployed to stop him, professional soldiers with decades of combat experience, were slaughtered wholesale. They fought bravely, holding their positions and following orders even as their entire command structure collapsed. But courage means nothing against a Daemon Primarch whose mere presence inspires terror and whose strength can tear apart armored vehicles with bare hands. The Space Marine chapters that responded to desperate calls for aid, deploying their best warriors and ancient relics, found themselves outmatched by a being who shrugged off their weapons as if they were toys. Bolter rounds that should have torn through any target bounced off Angron's daimonic hide. Power weapons that could cut through ceramite and adamantium failed to penetrate his brass-clad form, or were turned aside by the warp-forged armor he manifested.
He was not fighting as a general conducting a campaign. He was simply killing, moving through Armageddon's defenders like a force of nature, leaving only corpses and burning wreckage behind him. The Imperium's response to Angron's manifestation revealed just how dangerous a Daemon Primarch could be and how limited the options were for dealing with such threats. The Grey Knights, the most secretive and specialized chapter of Space Marines in the entire Imperium, were deployed in their entirety. 109 Grey Knights, warriors trained specifically to combat demonic threats, each one a psyker, selected from the strongest psychic individuals in the galaxy and conditioned to resist corruption. They came not to defeat Angron through military might, not to kill him in the way you might kill a normal enemy, but to perform the specific psychic rituals required to banish a greater daemon back into the warp. They were accompanied by vast supporting forces, including multiple Imperial Bard regiments providing covering fire, Navy vessels establishing orbital blockades, and Inquisitors coordinating the overall response. But the Grey Knights themselves would bear the brunt of the actual confrontation with the Daemon Primarch, standing between Angron and the terrified population of Armageddon, buying time with their lives for the rituals of banishment to be completed. The confrontation on Armageddon's ash wastes, in the shadow of Hive and Furnace as it burned from Angron's rampage, was apocalyptic in scale and horror. The Grey Knights, protected by psychic wards inscribed on their armor and wielded weapons specifically designed to harm demonic entities, advanced in perfect formation despite the overwhelming psychic pressure radiating from the Daemon Primarch. Their discipline was absolute, maintained through decades of training specifically for this kind of engagement. They chanted the rituals of banishment as they marched, each word a weapon against the creature before them, sacred syllables that wounded daemons at a metaphysical level. 13 Grey Knights died simply from being in Angron's presence before the battle even began, their minds unable to withstand the psychic pressure of a Daemon Primarch's rage, their consciousness burned out by proximity to such concentrated fury. Their bodies collapsed where they stood, blood running from their eyes and ears as their brains shut down from sensory overload. The others pressed forward, stepping over their fallen brothers, continuing the chant without pause or hesitation. They were not trying to survive this confrontation. They were trying to complete the ritual before they all died, buying seconds with their lives, each moment of delay another syllable of the banishment spoken. Angron killed them by the dozens, tearing through ceramite armor and sacred wards alike with strength that defied physical law. His claws, manifested from warp energy and blessed by Khorne, could tear apart even the heavily reinforced Terminator armor some Grey Knights wore. He moved with impossible speed for something his size, covering distances that should have taken minutes in seconds, appearing among formations that thought they had maintained safe distance. Grey Knights who had trained for decades, who had banished lesser daemons and fought greater daemons to standstills, died in moments when Angron turned his attention to them. But they held their ground, these warriors in silver armor with their psychic flames and blessed weapons, refusing to retreat even as their brothers fell around them. They formed a wall of bodies and determination, each fallen warrior replaced immediately by another stepping forward to continue the chant. The ritual required specific duration to complete, a continuous recitation of banishment that could not be interrupted or rushed. Every second they survived was another second closer to sending the Daemon Primarch back to the warp.
And in the end, with only a handful of Grey Knights still standing, with the ash wastes of Armageddon soaked in the blood of heroes whose names would be recorded in secret chronicles, they succeeded. The ritual reached its conclusion, the final syllable spoken with the last breath of warriors who knew they would not survive to see their victory. Angron's manifestation destabilized, his physical form losing cohesion as the banishment took effect.
His essence was forcibly torn from the material realm and cast back into the warp. His consciousness sent screaming across the immaterium to reform in Khorne's domain. The surviving Grey Knights, those few who had endured when over 100 had stood at the battle's beginning, collapsed in exhaustion and grief. They had saved Armageddon, but the cost was almost unbearable. The banishment of Angron on Armageddon required the sacrifice of 100 Grey Knights. Warriors who represented centuries of training and preparation each, irreplaceable assets who had given their lives to remove a single threat temporarily. It demonstrated conclusively that a Daemon Primarch could not be killed through any known means, only temporarily removed from reality at catastrophic cost. And that removal was never permanent, merely a delay until conditions allowed manifestation again. The surviving population of Armageddon, those millions who had witnessed the demonic invasion and lived to speak of it, presented another problem for the Imperium. They had seen things no citizen should see, witnessed truths about the galaxy that could drive entire populations to madness or heresy. The Inquisition made the decision that haunts Imperial records to this day. The witnesses were either executed outright or subjected to mind-wiping, their memories of Angron's manifestation erased as if the event had never occurred. Entire regiments of Imperial Guard who had fought bravely against impossible odds were killed by the same Imperium they had defended, their reward for courage being a bolt round to ensure their silence. Civilians who had survived the demonic onslaught were rounded up and processed, their minds wiped clean of the trauma they had endured. The Inquisition declared the entire campaign classified at the highest level, ensuring that the Imperium's citizens would never know how close one world had come to total damnation, how thin the barriers were between reality and the warp, how little could be done when a Primarch who had become a daemon decided to manifest and exact his will upon the material universe. The Grey Knights returned to Titan, their fortress monastery moon, having proven that they could banish a Daemon Primarch, but at costs that could not be sustained indefinitely. They had lost over 90% of their deployed force, a casualty rate that would take decades to replace, even with their specialized recruitment and training programs. If Angron manifested regularly, if he led his World Eaters in invasions with the same frequency he had shown in the past, the Grey Knights would eventually be destroyed simply through attrition. They could win individual battles, but would lose the war through the mathematics of irreplaceable losses.
It was a problem without solution, an existential threat that could only be managed rather than eliminated. The Imperium had no way to permanently destroy a Daemon Primarch, no weapon or ritual that could end Angron's existence rather than merely banishing him temporarily. They could only react when he appeared, throw their best warriors at him, and hope the banishment succeeded before he killed everyone trying to stop him. And then they would wait, knowing he would return eventually, knowing the next manifestation would claim more lives, knowing that this cycle would continue for as long as the Imperium endured. In the 10 millennia since his transformation, Angron has manifested countless times across the galaxy, each appearance following the same terrible pattern. Sometimes he leads massive invasions, like Armageddon, accompanied by thousands of World Eaters and Daemon hosts, targeting major Imperial worlds with strategic value. Other times, he appears for brief hours, manifesting through some random confluence of violence and warp energy, killing everything within reach before being banished back to the Immaterium by defending forces who respond with everything they have. Each manifestation is an exercise in uncontrolled violence and indiscriminate slaughter, the transformation of civilized worlds into charnel houses where nothing lives and nothing remains except corpses and burning ruins. Then comes banishment, either through overwhelming military force that makes maintaining physical form too costly,
or through specialized psychic ritual performed by those trained to combat demonic threats. And each time he is sent back to the warp, he reforms in Khorne's domain, his essence reconstituting in the immaterium, waiting for the next opportunity to tear through reality and resume the only activity he is still capable of understanding. There is no strategy to his manifestations, no grand plan or careful targeting of vital Imperial assets that would cripple the Imperium's ability to resist. Angron appears wherever the barrier between reality and warp grows thin through violence, wherever enough blood has been spilled to weaken the fabric of space and allow his essence to push through from the immaterium. A battlefield where millions have died, a world consumed by civil war, a hive city where gangs wage endless conflict in the underhive. These places become potential manifestation points, wounds in reality through which a Daemon Primarch can force his way into the material universe. He is less a general conducting campaigns and more a natural disaster, a hurricane of violence that strikes without warning and cannot be reasoned with or redirected. You cannot negotiate with Angron. You cannot offer him terms or territory in exchange for peace. You cannot appeal to his reason or his compassion or any quality that might have existed in the mortal Primarch. The daemon that wears Angron's name has none of those things, existing only to kill in Khorne's name, to spill blood for the blood god without consideration for whose blood, or why, or to what end beyond satisfying the eternal hunger of the entity he serves.
The Imperium maintains specialized response protocols for confirmed Daemon Primarch sightings, particularly for Angron, whose manifestations are more frequent than most of his daemon brothers. When reports indicate his presence, entire sectors can be quarantined to prevent the corruption from spreading. Grey Knights chapters are placed on alert, prepared to deploy at a moment's notice, despite knowing the casualties they will suffer. Psychic choirs are assembled to perform long-range banishment rituals. Dozens of astropaths combining their power to weaken the Daemon Primarch's hold on reality, even from great distances. But these responses are reactive rather than preventive, treating symptoms rather than addressing the disease. There is no way to stop Angron from manifesting. No method to predict where he will appear next beyond monitoring conflict zones and watching for the signs that precede demonic incursion. There is no way to negotiate with or contain a being whose entire existence has been reduced to murder, whose consciousness is so damaged and corrupted that communication is impossible. He is a force of nature wearing the shape of what once the Emperor's son, and like any force of nature, you can only prepare for his coming and try to survive his passage. The tragedy of Angron, when viewed across the full span of his existence, from mortal life to demonic eternity, is not that he fell to chaos in the way his brothers did. Many Primarchs made that choice, seduced by power or driven by genuine grievance against the Emperor who had created and then betrayed them. Magnus the Red fell trying to save his legion from persecution, choosing damnation over extinction. Mortarion fell trying to save his sons from the plague that consumed them, trading service to Nurgle for their survival. Perturabo fell out of bitterness at being unappreciated, using every thankless battle while others claimed glory and recognition. These were choices, however corrupted or desperate, made by beings who retained enough agency to choose their path. But Angron never chose anything after his childhood enslavement. He was enslaved as a child by the High Riders of Nuceria, property to be exploited for profit and entertainment. He was mutilated as a gladiator, the nails hammered into his skull without his consent, destroying his capacity for anything except rage and pain. He was denied his death as a rebel, teleported away from Desh'elika Ridge when he had earned the right to die free alongside his family. He was given a legion he never wanted, forced to command warriors who looked to him for leadership when all he wanted was to be left alone to die.
He watched his mind deteriorate over decades of progressive neural damage, losing pieces of himself day by day as the nails consumed his brain. And finally, he was transformed into a daemon, not because he sought power, but because someone else decided he needed saving from a death that would have been mercy. Every step of his journey from infant Primarch to Daemon Prince was decided by others, each choice made for him rather than by him.
The High Riders who implanted the nails, forcing cybernetic enhancements on a gladiator who showed too much compassion. The Emperor who teleported him away from his final stand, choosing his son's life over his son's wishes. Lorgar who performed the ritual of ascension, transforming Angron into a demon, despite knowing his brother did not want it, believing he was offering salvation when he was actually imposing the worst slavery imaginable. Even his service to Khorne is not truly voluntary in any meaningful sense. Not a choice he made, but a condition imposed through transformation. Demons are not independent beings with free will and agency. They are extensions of their patron gods, fragments of larger warp entities given temporary cohesion and purpose, existing to serve the will of the powers that created them. When Angron manifests, he is not making decisions about where to go or what to do or who to kill. He is simply following the nature that was imposed on him through transformation, an immortal slave acting out the only role he is still capable of playing, unable to choose differently because choice itself has been burned away along with everything else that made him a person rather than a weapon. The gladiator who fought for freedom became a demon who will never be free, not for a moment, not for eternity. The warrior who felt compassion so strongly that even the butcher's nails could not entirely destroy it, who used his empathic abilities to ease the suffering of others even through his own constant agony, became a monster incapable of any emotion except rage. The rebel who led a slave army and would have died free on Desh'elika Ridge, who refused to abandon his family even when offered power and glory beyond measure, became an eternal servant of the most tyrannical power in the universe. This is not a story of evil rewarded or ambition leading to downfall in the classic pattern of tragedy. This is a story of someone who was broken so thoroughly and so repeatedly that there was nothing left to save by the time anyone tried to save him. Lorgar thought he was offering salvation when he transformed Angron into a Daemon Primarch, believed he was giving his brother freedom from pain and the gift of immortality. But he had not understood what Angron actually wanted, had not listened when the gladiator spoke of Desh'elika Ridge and the death he had been denied. The Lord of the Red Sands had never sought power or eternal life or ascension to demonhood. He had sought death, an honorable death fighting alongside people he cared about, dying free rather than living as a slave to masters who cared nothing for his wishes. That death was denied him on Desh'elika Ridge when the Emperor teleported him away, stolen from him along with everything else that mattered. And it was denied him forever when Lorgar bound his soul to Khorne, transforming him into something that cannot die, that will exist for eternity in service to a god who demands nothing but blood. The Daemon Primarch Angron is immortal in the way that daemons are immortal, his existence sustained by the warp itself, unable to be permanently destroyed through any known means. But that immortality is the ultimate slavery, existence without end in service to a power that will never release him, that will demand his service for as long as the warp exists and mortals wage war. The High Riders enslaved his body, using chains and collars to restrain him physically. The butcher's nails enslaved his mind, rewiring his brain to crave violence and pain. And Khorne enslaved his soul, binding him to eternal service through transformation into daemon. Every part of him has been claimed by masters he never chose, used for purposes he never agreed to, exploited by those who saw him as a tool rather than a person with his own desires and agency.
Those who knew Angron before his transformation, the few World Eaters who survived long enough to remember and retained enough of their minds to reflect on what was lost, speak of him with something resembling pity when they dare to speak of him at all. They remember moments when their Primarch showed kindness despite the nails screaming in his skull. Times when he spoke quietly to dying warriors and eased their passage with his empathic abilities. Times when he showed flashes of the person he might have been without the nails, someone who cared deeply about his brothers, who valued loyalty and courage above strength, who understood what it meant to stand together against impossible odds, even when standing together meant dying together. Khorne the Betrayer, who became the most infamous World Eater of all, who spent 10,000 years killing in Khorne's name across 1,000 battlefields, still occasionally speaks of the Primarch he first met. The bleeding, raging demigod who had killed 12 officers in his grief and fury, but stopped when someone finally talked to him like a person rather than a weapon or a prize to be claimed. That Angron is gone, burned away in the transformation to Daemon, consumed by the ritual that was supposed to save him. What remains is a creature that wears his shape and carries his memories, but lacks everything that made him who he was, everything that separated the person from the beast. The Gladiator is dead, truly and finally dead, in a way that mortal death could never achieve. Only the monster remains, and the monster serves Khorne for eternity, exactly as the High Riders once forced him to serve in the arenas. But the arena is now the entire galaxy, and the scheduled murders never end, cannot end, will continue for as long as the Imperium endures and the warp exists.
Every manifestation is another performance in an arena that spans star systems. Another battle fought not for freedom or purpose, but because his nature demands it and his master requires it. The crowds that once watched him kill in the pits of Nuceria have been replaced by entire populations who die screaming as he descends upon their worlds. The gladiators he once fought beside, those brothers and sisters who chose to die free rather than live in chains, have been replaced by demons and corrupted space marines who serve the same dark power that enslaves him. And there is no escape, no final battle where he can die with honor, no Desh'elika Ridge where he can make his last stand alongside those who matter to him. There is only eternal service to Khorne, killing forever in the blood god's name. Unable to choose differently because choice was burned away when Lorgar completed the ritual that transformed slave into demon. Recent events in the 41st millennium have seen Angron manifest once more, participating in campaigns that demonstrate both his power and his tragedy. The galaxy has been split by the Great Rift, a massive warp storm called the Cicatrix Maledictum that divides the Imperium in half and makes travel and communication nearly impossible across vast regions of space. In this new era of darkness and chaos, demon manifestations have become more frequent and more stable than they were in the previous 10,000 years. The barriers between reality and warp have grown so thin in many places that greater demons, including Daemon Primarchs, can walk the materium with an ease not seen since the Horus Heresy itself. Angron's appearances last longer now, his physical form persisting for weeks or even months rather than the hours or days that once marked his manifestations. He can conduct sustained campaigns rather than brief rampages, leading his World Eaters in extended invasions that leave entire sectors burning. This means he represents an even greater threat than before, capable of strategic operations despite his nature as a creature of pure violence. The Imperium, already stretched to its breaking point defending against countless threats from all sides, must now account for the possibility that the Red Angel could appear anywhere and maintain his presence long enough to destroy entire sectors before being banished. And each time he manifests,
Each time he leads his world eaters in yet another campaign of mindless slaughter, each time he descends upon some unfortunate world and transforms it into a charnel house before being banished back to the warp, the tragedy deepens. Because somewhere in that demon, in some fragment of consciousness that might still exist beneath the rage and the corruption and the demands of Khorne's will, there might remain an echo of the person who once led a slave rebellion. The gladiator who cared enough about his family to refuse a Primarch's power rather than abandon them to die alone. The warrior who used his empathic abilities to comfort those who suffered even when his own suffering was beyond measure.
That person, if any trace still exists, is trapped in a body that serves Khorne, forced to participate in exactly the kind of tyranny he once fought against, unable to die, unable to change, unable to do anything except kill forever. He is conscious enough to manifest, to move through the materium, to lead armies and destroy worlds. But whether he is conscious enough to understand what he has become, to remember what he wanted, and realize how completely he has been denied even that final mercy of oblivion remains unknown. Perhaps the transformation was complete enough that nothing remains of Angron except the daemon wearing his name. Or perhaps some fragment of the gladiator persists, aware but unable to act, screaming silently while his body commits atrocities he would have despised in life. Either possibility is its own form of damnation. The slaves of Nuceria who followed Angron into the mountains, who chose freedom over survival, called themselves the Eaters of Cities to strike fear into those who oppressed them. They died on Desh'elika Ridge without their leader, betrayed not by Angron, but by an emperor who thought he need better than his son, who thought a legion of Gene sons was adequate replacement for the family that had bled together in the arenas and the highlands. Those gladiators believed they were dying for freedom, that their sacrifice would mean something, that their leader would die free even if they could not. They were wrong about that last part. Angron never died. He was denied that mercy, denied that freedom, denied the honorable end he had earned through years of fighting against impossible odds. Instead, he was given a legion that did not want him, a lifetime of service to an imperium he despised, and finally, an eternity of slavery to a god who demands everything and gives nothing in return, except the power to kill forever. The Eaters of Cities died free. Their rebellion ended, but their choice their own. Their final stand made on their own terms. Angron lives enslaved, and always will, forever and eternally, until the last star burns out and the warp itself ceases to exist. That is the tragedy complete and absolute. Not that a hero fell to darkness, but that someone who deserved better than any of his brothers received the worst fate imaginable. Slavery as a child under the high riders of Nuceria, property to be bought and sold and used. Mutilation as a gladiator, the nails destroying his capacity for anything except violence and pain. Abandonment as a rebel, teleported away from the death he had earned alongside his family. Deterioration as a Primarch, watching his mind slowly consumed by progressive neural damage. And finally, transformation into something that would serve forever the very principles he had spent his entire mortal life fighting against. The High Riders enslaved his body with chains and collars and the threat of violence. The Butcher's nails enslaved his mind through neural manipulation that made violence the only relief from constant agony. And Khorne enslaved his soul through transformation into demon, binding him to eternal service that can never be escaped or negotiated or ended through any means known to the Imperium or its enemies. Angron never knew a single day of true freedom in his entire existence, mortal or demonic. From the moment the slavers found him in that impact crater, to the present day where he manifests across the galaxy as Khorne's champion. And he never will know freedom, not for eternity.
Not while the warp exists and the blood god demands service from his chosen champion. The arenas of Nuceria are ruins now, destroyed during the Shadow Crusade when Angron returned to his homeworld with Lorgar and the combined forces of 2 traitor legions. Desh'elika Ridge is a memorial of sorts, though whether it honors the gladiators who died there or serves as a warning against rebellion depends on who you ask and when. The World Eaters continue their endless war across the galaxy, fragmented into countless warbands, but united in their worship of violence and their shared genetic heritage from a father who never wanted them. And somewhere in the warp, in the brass citadel that serves as Khorne's domain within the Immaterium, the Daemon Primarch Angron waits between manifestations. Perhaps he remembers the arenas and the fighting pits where he learned to kill. Perhaps he remembers Onomas and the others who died in the slave revolt, the friends who believed in freedom enough to fight for it. Perhaps he remembers the Emperor's golden armor and that moment of betrayal on Desh'elika Ridge when he was stolen from his final stand. Or perhaps the transformation burned all of that away, leaving only rage and hunger and the eternal demands of the blood god who will never release his champion from service. Either way, when he manifests again, when reality tears open and the Red Angel descends upon some unfortunate world, the result will be the same as it always is and always has been. Blood and death and slaughter without end or meaning or purpose beyond satisfying Khorne's eternal hunger. A Primarch who was designed to be humanity's defender, reduced to its destroyer. A gladiator who fought for freedom, transformed into the ultimate slave. That is the tragedy of Angron, complete and absolute and eternal. And it will echo through the galaxy for as long as the Imperium endures and the warp exists to spawn demons from the souls of the damned.